Thank you very much. I hope I can keep you awake after lunch. It's a good lunch as well, thank you. The film you're watching as you were coming in is of a school in the East London Borough of Newham, which is the most inclusive local authority in the United Kingdom, with less than half of 1% of children not in mainstream schools. And there were, in that school of 440 children, there were 47 children, including 30 with severe learning difficulties. So, to me, it proves it's possible, and I've seen inclusion working under a tree in Africa. I've been to a school which does reverse inclusion in Delhi, where half the children are disabled and half are not, and they are managing every type of impairment. To me, it's really, as a disabled person, someone who grew up with a post-polio impairment and later other injuries from that, it sort of makes sense to have a different view of the world now in this 21st century to the one I was subjected to, where my first experience of rejection was the local primary school, which had 3 steps and said, you can't come, you're a fire risk. So I was sent to a school for physically handicapped children, which I didn't like, and I didn't stay there long. But when I eventually got to a mainstream secondary school after 8 years somewhere else, private school paid by the council, I was bullied by the other kids, messed about on the stairs, but I was very pleased to be there because I was part of society, I wasn't somewhere different. And then when I became a teacher, some 10 years later, I was bullied by the kids and by the head teacher because I was disabled. So not much changes. And I want to emphasise today the oppression that is disability, and we need to call it by its name, disableism. And calling it special needs, or we're all special, doesn't get away from the fact that throughout society, in all ages and at all times, disabled people have been discriminated and prejudiced against. And that is a huge dam behind us of attitudes that need to be addressed if we're to make inclusion happen. Perhaps the most important thing that's happened in the last century for disabled people is a paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts, according to Kuhn, are shifts that can lead you to seeing the same information in a completely different way. So we haven't changed as disabled people, but the UN Convention and the campaigning that went on for the 25 years before it were people getting us to see disabled people in a different way. And this is no less radical than saying that the Earth goes around the Sun rather than that the Sun goes around the Earth. And at the time of Copernicus, the Holy Church in Rome imprisoned people who dared to say that the Earth wasn't the centre of our galaxy. Now we'll take that, a 3 or 4 year old child will tell you that that's the case. Such is the nature of paradigm shifts. This one, is that a duck or is it a rabbit? Depends how you look at it. And more recently, the climate accord reached in Paris, which has a major impact on many low-lying countries in this region, we managed to shift from seeing that finance was what drives the world, in fact drives the world to destruction if we carry on in the way that we're being, to realising we have to pull in and control consumption, control production, and control the amount of emissions so that we can survive as a human race. That's a big paradigm shift, and it seems some important people in power, like Mr. Trump, haven't got the message. But hopefully most other country leaders have. So paradigm shifts really change the way we see things. The UN DESA is the agency for change, social action. Put it this way, the convention, the UNCRPD, when I talk about the convention, that's what I'm talking about, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, follows decades of work by the United Nations to change attitudes and approaches to persons with disabilities. I think that's a big ask. they were prompted to do that by disabled people. We had the year of disabled people in 1981, then we had a decade, 1991 to 2001, and still most diplomats in New York would not accept that we needed a separate human rights treaty until the international disability movement put their heads together all around the world, and Disability Awareness and Action, led by Richard Rieser at that time, collected 2.7 million examples of disability discrimination around the world. Once that had been done, it was clear that we needed proper human rights legislation for disabled people. And at the centre of that, it was to move us from being seen as objects of charity, medical treatment or social protection, towards viewing persons with disabilities as subjects with rights who are capable of claiming those rights and making decisions for their lives based on their free and informed consent, as well as being active members in society. That is going to take a while to go through, and particularly it will take a while in education. But it came from a group of disabled people who were incarcerated in long-stay homes in England in the 1970s. They called them the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation. And they argued that why should they be locked up just because they had an impairment? Couldn't they be given the support they needed to live in the community? And from that, a model was developed that, yes, we have impairments, and our impairments make us different, and will always make us different from other people. And I don't think we should hide that. I think we should be proud of it and empowered as disabled people. But our impairment is not the main problem that we have. Disablement comes, or disability comes from the loss of opportunities to take part in the normal life of the community on an equal level with others due to physical and social barriers. That was adopted here in Malaysia in 1981 by Disabled People International. And there were strong delegations from disabled people in Malaysia as part of that conference, as well as Southern Africa. So it wasn't just the North telling everyone else what to do. It was a global movement which was appalled, really, by Rehabilitation International, doctors and others in white coats telling us that they knew more about our lives than we do, which is not the case. And indeed, the convention that we're talking about had the byword 25 years later, when this became a reality, nothing about us without us. And that means getting the informed views of persons with disabilities and their representative organisations at every level when you are actually changing systems. Not to do it, and oh, by the way, you might want to know we don't. Asking them first. We are the experts. We will always be the experts. We welcome those allies who are professionals who are on our side in seeking social justice and inclusion. But never forget that the disabled person is the expert. If they're not, it's partly because of the way that we have actually educated and brought them up. We've disempowered them, segregated and isolated education away from society, disempowers, doesn't create rights. The convention is very clear that that has to end. But before I go on to that, I want to say a little bit about these ideas that have been with us for a very, very long time in every society in many, many different ways. For thousands of years, people's lives were ruled by superstition and interpretations of nature which depended on all-powerful deities or gods. Disabled people were penitent sinners, figures of fun, freaks, evil, and so it goes on. We were often seen as evil or seeking to get our revenge, or the product of bad karma, or some other reincarnation theory. These stereotypes persist in literature and the media throughout the world today and are recycled regularly. You only have to look at Marvel Comics to see that all the forces of evil are disabled people in those cartoon films. And of course the superheroes are generally not, apart from one who is blind. In East Africa today, it is widely believed that albinos have magical powers and their bones are magic. They have to put a foot of concrete over the grave of an albino so it's not dug up and their bones sold for great amounts of money. That is happening in 2017, and it is an appalling state of affairs. 50% of Indians believe disability was always, or almost always, a curse of God, said the World Bank in 2007. So these ideas are around. Going back 3,000 years to the ancient Greeks, here we have the mythology of Hephaestus, born with a club foot, a minor impairment that today we can deal with by just cutting a couple of tendons. But then, and right up until the current last century, people like Lord Byron and many others were disabled the whole of their lives because of their club foot. In Hephaestus, he, being disabled and with gods, made up by human beings of course, favoured a eugenicist future, that is, killing off the imperfect. Plato and Aristotle preached this at some length, and it framed the whole way that disability was seen for 2,500 years. In fact, right up until the Nazi Third Reich, which killed 1 million disabled people just because they were disabled. Hephaestus survived drowning because he was immortal, but then he came up, and unlike the other gods who lived on wine, women and song, he had to work for his living, and he was a lowly blacksmith, but he turned that against the others to get his comeuppance. Here's a woodcut of an actual witch trial that happened in 1613 in Oxford, and the main evidence that was brought against these 3 witches was that they were disabled, and it led to them being hung. 8 million women were murdered in 250 years across Europe in the witch hunts. This was a reaction to the change from people being tied to the land and the feudal system to modern day trade capitalism coming in. And so they were blamed as scapegoats. Well, Bruegel here taking an old parable, the blind leading the blind, and it's painted for laughs, because you can see what's going to happen just in a Mr. Magoo film or any other sorts of comedy at our expense. We are laughed at because of our impairment. King Richard III, one of Shakespeare's great plays, is portrayed as a serial killer, though there's no historical record to support that, and multiply impaired, with a humpback, which is true, because his skeleton was found a few years ago in a car park in Leicestershire, and with an arm, not true, and a lame leg, not true, because we've seen on the skeleton they weren't there. This was embroidered by the Tudor kings, Henry VIII and so on, because they had usurped the throne and they wanted to make him a very unpopular king. So disability was used. It's quite common a few years ago throughout the Asian subcontinent to see children with learning difficulties tied up while their parents went out to work in the fields. And I don't know if this is still happening, but it's shocking. And begging, of course, is very much still on our streets, and indeed people mutilated so they can actually get more money. And this is one of those Batman films, Two-Face, one side good, one side evil. No prizes for guessing which is which. The disfigured side is the evil side, and Changing Faces, a charity of people with facial disfigurement, wrote to the producers saying, why is it once again you reaffirm this old stereotype that is of course not true? So we live between 2 worlds, the reality and the mythology that we get from our past. And this has a big impact, if not challenged, at every level of the education system. So the old model, which the convention does away with, sees the problem in the child, the student. Can't get to school or get in or around the building. Can't keep up with the class. Does not understand. Will be bullied by other children. Needs specialist teaching and help. Needs to be kept away from other children. Is not like other children. Wastes scarce resources. Is contagious. Is bewitched evil. Subject of punishment. We weren't accepting that over the last 25 or 30 years. These are protests from all over the world of disabled people and their families saying we need to organise and fight for rights. Not just in education, but in every part of society, getting on the bus, getting into public buildings, people with learning difficulties saying our problem is not our intellectual impairment. It's that we have a learning difficulty and you have failed to educate us because you haven't understood it. So this powerful upsurge comes together at the UN Convention. First convention in the world ever made by the people it was about. And more than 1,000 disabled people came from all over the world to New York. on 8 separate occasions, and wrote the convention. So the convention now was adopted by the General Assembly in December 2006, and we're now 11 years nearly from that time. Most countries have adopted it and taken it into law, and I'll say more about that. But what it requires is this shift in thinking, this paradigm shift I talked about at the beginning, to a human and social rights model, addressing the barriers. So instead of our model in the school before, the school needs to, as a system, address negative attitudes, superstition, change rigid methods of curriculum assessment, adapt inaccessible buildings and environments, improve quality of teaching to prevent dropout, provide person-centred and functional assessment and plans, provide teachers and schools with training and support, inform, involve parents and DPOs and their peers, make and provide aids and equipment, reduce costs to pupils' families, develop expertise in alternative communication, braille, sign and so on, using new technology where we can. That's a pretty clear shift that has to come about. I put it another way. Under the old traditional views, we were not seen as humans not capable of education in the main. That question shows we didn't go to school. Then there was a decision that we should be put in separate establishments, isolated. So the square block children are separated from the regular round block children in 2 separate locations. Then the regular school, the round red blocks, has a unit out in the garden or around the playground where the disabled children are being educated separately. Then we went on to integration, which was introduced in the 1980s, and this really was about adapting the child with disabilities to fit in with what was really going on through therapy, rehabilitation. If the child can't cope with the school as it is, they're excluded. Then we had another variant on that, which is probably the dominant one in many schools in North America, for instance, that you are in the same building, but you're in a separate classroom. And if there's not much mixing, then you might as well be in a separate school. And last of all, the vision that children of all shapes and sizes are welcome. The school adapts to provide support and makes adjustments to meet their needs. So, if we put that into geographic forms, the old way of seeing the problem in the child, so you have different schools for different children. Those labels for children give them a different shape, and some can be accommodated in mainstream schools or resource mainstream schools, but once their impairment makes them too different, they drop below the line of visibility. So they're not seen by their peers in the community. They don't know anybody. Some, it can do extreme psychological damage, such as we've done with traditionally blind and deaf schools, where we've taken children at a very young age from their loved ones and caused all sorts of psychological problems to take them to specialist schools. Of course, the wisdom of that is now challenged, and we see that we have to move to a different path, which is that the child and their teacher are the important things, and instead of all the resources that are there in the first diagram being spread out, we close those resources and bring them to support the relationship of the child and teacher in the school, in the mainstream school. That may mean having a local district resource officer with specialists who can come and support physios, speech languages, visually impaired service. In some areas it means going peripatetic service to cover all schools, particularly in rural areas. And this is based on developing a child-centred approach, teacher trained in inclusion, building and learning materials are accessible, specialist advice and support, curriculum is flexible, peer support, community educated for inclusion, special schools become a resource centre, and peripatetic specialist teachers. So that's the transformation that the CRPD requires of all governments. Put it another way, at the Geneva conference, Professor Melensko, a friend of mine, known to many of you, put it this way: inclusion is a process. It has to be seen as never-ending search for better ways of responding to diversity. Inclusion is concerned with identification and removal of barriers. It is about presence, participation, and achievement of all students. You can't have inclusion if you don't have presence with mainstream peers. You can't have inclusion in a separate school. It is not possible. You can have participation and achievement, but you will be in a separate silo away from everyone else. Inclusion also involves a particular emphasis on those groups of learners who may be at risk of marginalisation, exclusion and underachievement, which includes many children with disabilities, though not all. So 174 countries have ratified the convention. 92 have also ratified the optional protocol. That means the citizens of your country can take you to the CRPD committee if legal processes in your country are exhausted. And as you can see, the whole of Southeast Asia there have all ratified. In other words, this is what has to happen, not we may do it or we might do it at some point. And from the moment that governments ratify, they are under a legal duty, an international legal duty, to make reasonable accommodations. Not wait until expenses allow for it. There is a clause in there saying that you can wait to do all of it until you have the right amount of money, but that doesn't apply to reasonable accommodations and the fundamental rights in the Convention. So there is no waiting once you've signed, you have to get on with changing. How does this fit in with the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, we've heard that inclusion, disability is mentioned 11 times, and that in Sustainable Development Goal 4, there are a number of places where it is also mentioned. But this now, of course, doesn't just apply to poorer countries, as the old Millennium Development Goals does. It applies to every country. So, we have to end poverty in rich countries as well as poor countries. We have to ensure a more even spread of prosperity for the many, not the few, to coin a phrase that's used in British politics at the moment. It's ensuring peace, which means that we eradicate the causes, one of the major causes in the world of impairment, which is war, and often left long after the war has ended with landmines blowing up and mutilating children. It means developing partnerships and agendas for a global change and looking after our planet. So inclusive schools will also be the basis for achieving the principles of the SDGs, because everyone will be there. There are two roads to go. This is from my old friend Jack Pierpoint, who was a pioneer of inclusive education in Canada. So we can go down the road to exclusion, which is segregation, brokenness, elitism, group homes, institutions, special schools, classes, ghettos, gangs, violence and abuse, nursing homes for the elderly, prisons for the miscreants, or we can go another way in our societies, inclusion. Wholesome, harmony, integration, life in real families, quality schools, kids belonging together, neighbours and friends meeting each other in the community. Whichever their diversity, their ethnicity, their background, it doesn't matter. Crossing over. There are malevolent forces in the world that try and take us back to the road to exclusion, but by and large, I think we are making progress, even though it's slow, on a more inclusive world. It's up to everyone here to do your bit to make it a bit faster in moving to that place. When we come back to school and education, we have two choices as well. We can see the child's deficit as faulty, as a problem, that we have to spend long hours diagnosing and labelling. Then certain resources are attached to the child, but their impairment remains the focus, and in order to ensure the resources are in the right place, we have to spend a lot of time, money and professional expertise assessing, monitoring, giving programs of therapy. And if it doesn't work in the mainstream, then there are always segregated services. Throughout this whole process, the child, and I can tell you having been on the receiving end of it, your ordinary needs are put on hold. A friend of mine who had cerebral palsy and was not very manually adept at fine motor movement spent 7 years in her special school learning to tie her shoelaces. At the end of the 7 years, she couldn't tie her shoelaces any more than she could at the beginning. Did she need to? There are such things as slip-on shoes. So this mindless way that we try and make children normal is deficit thinking. It is dangerous and child abuse. It should not be happening. We need to be valuing each and every child for who they are, their strengths and needs defined by themselves and others, outcome-based programs designed, not normative, but based on what the child has done best before, and then always moving on into the zone where they're learning. Not repetition, which I see far too often going around many, many different schools all around the world, children doing repetitious tasks that have no pedagogic value whatsoever. Resources made available to the ordinary services, as we saw on the diagram before last. Training for parents, most importantly. Often community-based rehabilitation is the first means of reaching the parents, and we saw an excellent film this morning about how that can work. Relationships are nurtured. The child isn't seen as broken or not part of the family. It's a valued part of the family. And then they can go to school and be supported. Diversity is welcome, and the society will change. That is what is being set out in Article 24 from the Convention. Before we look at that, we should look at the general principles of that Convention, because these are not negotiable. These, when you sign up to it, are what you have to take on board. Respect for the inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices, independence of the person. Non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society. That's one that the British government, who have opted out of the Article 24 under the Conservatives, can't get out of, because they are still signed up to inclusion in society. Respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities are part of human diversity. Equality of opportunity, accessibility, that's interesting. This is the first treaty that makes accessibility a human rights principle. So it's not, we'll make a ramp if we've got a bit of money at the end. If there are new buildings going up, or adaptations to buildings, by international finance, which will be from countries in the north, all of whom are signed up to the Convention, or your own country, which is signed up, it is not possible. In fact, it is unlawful for the building to not be accessible. And I hope, very much hope, that people will get a little more active and start taking governments and businesses to court, because that's the only way you can enforce this stuff. It won't happen without a struggle. Respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities, respect for their right of children with disabilities to preserve their identity, and their identity is a child with disability. And that rules out things like plastic surgery for people with Down syndrome, or breaking the legs of people of short stature to make them slightly taller. That's the easy option, and it's not all right. The harder one is to change and challenge the attitudes in society. And that governments have a duty to do on the mass media, to take out time for advertising, to take out time for adverts in the newspapers, to change attitudes in the society. And that's been done very successfully by many countries, South Africa, Moldova, Brazil, South Sudan even, in the middle of a war. So I'm sure countries in Southeast Asia are doing it and can do it more. So let's come on to the essence of what the change for the 21st century has to be. It's to make this commonplace, what is in this Article 24, unexceptional and the norm. Requires all signatories to ensure all disabled children and young people can fully participate in state education systems, and that this should be an inclusive system at all levels. That's from preschool right up to tertiary, primary, secondary, vocational and adult learning. Development by persons with disabilities of their personality, talents and creativity, as well as their mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. The right to be delivered in inclusive primary and secondary education systems, from which disabled people should not be excluded. I keep bumping into people here, well-meaning people who've come to learn, and they're either special educators working separately, or they're special educators working alongside mainstream teachers, or they're mainstream teachers who say, we can't do it because we haven't been trained. My argument to that is, have you been trained as a teacher? If you've been trained as a teacher, you are trained to teach all children. That is the fundamental point of being a teacher. I'm a teacher myself. And you are at a graduate level precisely so that you can actually work out solutions to the problems that come along. If you can't do it on your own, you need to do it with your colleagues. Within the staff room of any school is sufficient knowledge to solve nearly all the problems that we're going to come across. If we don't, then let's bring in peripatetic experts from outside to give us a bit more of an idea. But basically, the pedagogy is the same. We're just adapting how we do it. Reasonable accommodations, as I say, have to be in place from the moment that you all signed up to this convention, should be provided for individual requirements and support provided in individualised programmes to facilitate effective social and academic education. That's now. That's for every disabled child in every school, in a mainstream school, or indeed a special school. They need those reasonable accommodations so they can access to their fullest potential what's going on. Instruction in Braille, Sign Language and ACC needs to be there. I was in a workshop yesterday, there was a long discussion about whether there should be 1 or 2 sign languages in Malaysia. There has to be 1, there can't be 2. Just because one group of people have got a different way of doing it from the past, that doesn't continue. It has to be one unified form of sign language, because otherwise you can't really access it in education, produce resources for it. Employment of disabled teachers, we've not heard much about that. How many teachers here would consider themselves disabled people? Persons with disabilities? 1? Any more? I've seen some other people going around with mobility aids and so on. No, only 1 person? Well, I'm sure there are more of you. The point is to be proud that you are a disabled teacher, because you are a role model. You can change the whole way that schools will change. We need to create quotas in our teacher training programs. And if because of the history of how disabled people are educated, they reach a slightly lower academic level, although for them it will be a big achievement, we should allow them onto teacher training courses so that they can actually show the expertise of their life experience to all the disabled children who need them. We need to train professionals and staff who work at all levels of the education system. Such training should incorporate disability equality or awareness training, such as some of that which I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. They need to look at different means of communication and different pedagogies. And don't forget the general comment. I won't go over that again. We had a very interesting discussion for 90 minutes with about 45 of you. But it's a pity that we aren't doing a whole session on that. But it is a rather dusty and difficult document. But it is the Bible of implementing Article 24. It is law. It is international law. It's not advisory. General comment number 4 came out of the fact that in the first 45 country-state reports, not a single one was complying with Article 24. And so the committee, which is 20 people, 19 of whom are disabled, elected by state parties, said we have to have a general comment that tightens up Article 24. And so number 4 is a brilliant attempt to do that and takes us far forward in our thinking. So you don't have to do a lot of blue sky thinking, it's all been done for you in in general comment number 4. And don't forget, there is an awareness raising duty on state parties, fostering at all levels of the education, including all children from an early age, an attitude of respect for the rights of persons with disabilities. So I think that is the convention. I want to talk now about the 2 tracks that came out of a project I did for UNICEF 4 years ago on worldwide, looking at how we prepare teachers for children with disabilities. There are 70 million teachers in the world. We're going to need more of them to reach the standard SDG 4. Probably going to need 100 million by that time. It's going to cost more, and I'll talk about costs later on. How do we train them? Well, we have to train all our teachers in the foundations, in track 1 of on the principles of equality and child empowerment. That's for all children. So track 1 of teachers' training, which should be both initial training but continued service training, is developing equality and valuing difference, identifying barriers, finding solutions, differentiation, flexible curriculum and assessment, collaborative learning and peer support, anti-bias curriculum, challenging sexism, racism, disableism, homophobia, stimulating an interesting multi-sensory learning environment for all. The books on this are produced by UNESCO Bangkok. They're excellent, 9 volumes that can be downloaded. They go over all of this, and I would recommend them. But that's not enough. If we only trained our teachers on doing that, and some have argued that, including my friend Melensko and Dr. Professor Booth, I don't agree with them. I think the Convention says we have to go further than that and look at track 2 to educate all teachers about the impairment-specific needs of disabled children. Dr. Francis Gentle did that this morning on vision impairment. That's all it takes. That 1 hour on vision impairment, all of you who are here for that will now understand that and incorporate it in your practice. We need about 10 of those lectures on the teacher training course with some practical follow-up. Nobody can tell me that they can't put that on a teacher training course. Of course they can. And for teachers in service, we need something else. So what are those particular accommodations? I don't know, we missed one there. Child-centred and quality education, right. Well, I'm not going to go over the things she mentioned this morning because they're there. For deaf-blind children, they're more specific. Tactile environments, deaf-blind language is separate to sign language. We need to learn that. Deaf and hard of hearing, sign language, interpreting, oral, figure spelling, hearing aids, support, visual environments, physical impairment, access or infrastructure, toilets, furniture, equipment, prosthesis, maintaining things like wheelchairs, personal assistance, diet, transportation, medication. Specific learning difficulties, which covers far more learners than we think, maybe 10% we think, are dyslexic, dyspraxic, and are often seen to be the lazy ones or the silly ones in the class. And we know that our prisons are full of them because of our failure as an educational system around the world. So we have to do something about that. Colour overlays, backgrounds, easy read, tapes and text to talk, spelling checkers, concrete objects, iPads now, and so on. Speech and communication, again, a big area with many children not developing language, and there just aren't enough speech and language therapists to go around. And so teachers have to understand this and be able to do what is necessary to get those children talking. And if we bring oral language into the curriculum and encourage children to speak and communicate with each other and their peers, it's a big step towards doing that. General cognitive impairment. Well, we have to recognise that this is one of the areas that many teachers balk at. Well, these children are so far below the level of most of their peers, how can they be in my class? All right, they stay in grade 1, but can they be in grade 6 or grade 10? Why not? Why not? We have to devise alternate curriculums. We have to diversify the curriculum. We have a small steps curriculum, easy read, scaffolding, Makaton, other symbol languages, info grids, concrete objects, which we've already heard about. When you're doing a topic, collect objects for that topic, label them. When your colleague teacher does it the next time, get them to add to the box. Keep building up the concrete objects so that all children can access the subject matter of what's going on. Mental health and behaviour, again an area that many teachers balk at. But this is about getting children to manage their own anger. It's about understanding where that anger comes from. It's about giving enough flexibility to say children on the autistic spectrum to be able to be in the position that they are, which as adults they will say is we are neurodiverse. We're not a deficit, we just think differently. And we know that some of the greatest thinkers in history have been on the autistic spectrum, whether it be Albert Einstein, Michelangelo, many that come to be thought about. Behaviour policy. A behaviour policy should not be punitive. It should be self-controlling. The children themselves should take control of it. If they feel that they can't manage in the classroom, we should allow differentiation for behaviour. Taking out my orange card, I need to go outside to cool down for 5 minutes. Taking out my red card, I'm going to blow if I stay here any longer. And they're going to a safe space, which could be the caretaker of the school, could be the cook, could be anybody allocated to befriend them so they can actually deal with it. We don't put all these children in one place, there aren't that many in any one school, so they can actually be spread around amongst the staff. So these sorts of things need to be taught to all teachers. That doesn't give you enough expertise to do a complete assessment or anything like that, but it does undermine the concerns and fears that many teachers have. Screening, identification, key adjustments for the main impairments need to be taught for all teachers. And how do we do this for all of the teachers we've got in the world? Well, we can do it in college, and that's quite a useful way that's been done, but it is very expensive. And if we need 30 million more teachers in 15 years, we aren't going to do it that way. So we're going to have to do it through distance learning, ICT, DVD, radio, summer schools that people attend during the holidays and so on, and learning on the job. And what about our colleagues who are already there? They are the biggest bulk of teachers. And they all need in-service and continuing professional development. I would suggest mandatory. When computers came in, it wasn't acceptable for a teacher to say, oh, I can't deal with that, I don't know anything about that. All teachers were expected to become IT literate, and maybe in some countries still are. But it's a wave that is moving quite fast through education. Is it any more difficult to learn about inclusion than to learn about IT? I don't think so. So, the best method I did when we looked at this, I found from the literature review and looking at what was going on around the world, was for this in-service to take place in the school itself, with all the teachers together undergoing the training, looking at the problems that they have in the school, having maybe supervision from someone from a university to come and do it, and it can then be accredited as master's level study when they do an individual study as well, maybe with a summer school. And once that's happened, yes, the teachers should be remunerated for their extra qualification. And it takes the sting out of people saying, well, I'm having all this burden put upon me. No, you're actually having your professional tool bag enhanced, so you can actually work in more and different varieties of schools. We found that cascading doesn't work very well. Taking one teacher out from each school and they then go back and train their colleagues, that doesn't work very well. Individual teachers undertaking individual awards does not work very well either. It's very good for the individual teacher, and they usually leave within a few years to go to the higher education sector. So if we want good, trained teachers for inclusion, we have to keep them in the schools, we have to fund them to be in the schools, we have to reward them for what they're doing in the schools, and recognise this is a very valuable job to society. And it should be supported by district-based training for all at local resource centres. And this isn't a place to dump kids, this is a place where teachers go to learn from each other and to exchange resources. And all needs to be followed up. I'll click on a bit. And let's not forget the leaders of the schools. They need to be in the driving seat of making this happen. Having a budget given to them that they can manage to buy in the university, become and train their teachers and so on. And it should be part of professional development for teachers. And I think it could be linked with those other 5 areas, the principles of the Sustainable Development Goals, including inclusion, so that we can be training all teachers on all of those areas, which will then make a huge difference to the children around the world. Okay, I'll move on and give a few practical ideas now. So the practical way you can test out the social human rights model in your school, go back to the school and say, let's think of a child who's blind, who's deaf, a child with significant learning difficulty, a child who can't speak, a child with difficult behaviour, maybe on the autistic spectrum. What are the barriers in our school that we are presenting to that child? Make a lot of cards like a brick wall, and then sit round in a staff meeting and fill them in. How many barriers can you find in your school? When I did this with the head teacher of Blackburn in Lancashire, they found 784 barriers in their collective schools. So there are plenty of barriers out there. But rather than talking about them and moaning about them, let's identify them, and then we can actually knock them down. Put in practice at a school level that changes these barriers. That's what the process of developing inclusion at a school level is about. And of course it can be supported by government, who make the curriculum more flexible, make the grade system and the assessment system more flexible, and provide the resources in different formats. So if there's a standard reading text, let's have it at an easy read stage, a pictogram stage, and a more complex stage, so that the whole range can be dealt with in one set of books. Poor teaching as well. Fear is perhaps the biggest one, and low expectations. What would you expect of these children? These children, just Down syndrome children, we wouldn't expect very much of them, really. I've got a friend, Pablo Pineda, who's got a master's, is the first qualified teacher with a master's in Europe, is also a film star. He's got Down syndrome. His mother believed in him and sent him to mainstream school. That was the main difference for him than other children. Not all children with Down syndrome are at that level, I agree, it varies, but there are many that can do that. So, rather than complicated IEPs and assessment models, these are the questions you need to ask on a person-centered model. What are you going to do? What are my dreams? What do I want to achieve? What are my needs? My strengths? And I need help from who? Now, the younger child won't be able to answer all of these, but their peers will, their parents will, those children who know them will, and they should be involved in a circle, a solution circle, to come up with this, empowering the person. So that's not very complicated, and you don't have to go on a special degree to learn about that. It's a person-centered approach. Another useful thing I picked up going around, this is from Gary Bunch, Professor of Inclusion at York, Ontario. As you're planning any lesson for pupils, ask yourself, what are the essential knowledge, skills and understanding you want all students to get from the lesson? How do my pupils learn best? Take account of the things we've already heard about, their learning styles and their preferences. What modifications to the lesson plan would permit more pupils to learn more effectively in my classroom? So this requires more planning time for teachers, less loading on their contact time, more planning time, and if they're working with support staff or volunteers, time for those people to also be planning with them. So the teacher becomes the team leader rather than doing it all on their own, which of course you can't do if you've got a class of 40 to 60. And developing all sorts of scaffolding, the words that we're going to use in a different part of the curriculum, pictures with words and so on, that children can use with Velcro that they can stick on to boards and all sorts of things like that. And then, did they learn what you set out to learn? So the assessment has to be very much formative assessment about what they've actually learned in this lesson. That can be just 5 things written on a piece of paper, 5 questions answered, 2 questions answered. It doesn't have to be rote repetition of what was learned. It has to be, what did they really understand by that? And that can be right across the curriculum. Moving on time, I think. Okay, so some examples of adjustments I've seen around. This is in a film I made for the British government. Sign language, maths in mainstream school where there was signers and teachers working alongside each other. Children with support. This boy had ASD. But what was interesting in this class was that there was a differentiated behaviour policy. So he had Tourette's syndrome, so he used to shout out obscenities. The rest of the children had been taught not to take any notice of it. It worked perfectly well. This girl with cerebral palsy in a standing frame, but joining in with other children in a PE lesson. This girl with dyslexia being the minute taker of the school council. the very person who you think couldn't take minutes, they gave her a laptop and said, "You're the minute taker." Or here, a girl with short stature wearing the red hat of a bully buster who's on duty in the playground. The only way we're going to challenge bullying is by children themselves challenging it, by them understanding it's not something that is acceptable in our school community. Here, children with behavioural difficulties in the secondary school, this is in England, they work an afternoon 2-hour shift without a break. They gave them a 5-minute break to let off steam between lessons. Children much calmer in the afternoon. 2 children with uncontrolled epilepsy in a mainstream school, just wearing their crash helmets, and their medication was quite interesting in this case. They had Reptol diazepam that needed to be administered. No teachers wanted to touch it. The head said, "Well, you don't have to touch it. I'm going to get the nurse in. She'll train all of you. And then anyone who doesn't want to do it, let me know." Nobody said they wouldn't do it in a life-threatening situation. And yet these medical needs can often be built up out of all proportions so children never come to school. After-school clubs with karate, a boy in wheelchair managed to get a high Dan, boy with a physical impairment of his hand, doing experiment with acids with another boy, so peer support. Boy with Down syndrome joining in games with his peers in the garden. PE, which is integrated for those with ambulant impairments to join in. Pupils who are deaf and with autism having support. Boy with on the autistic spectrum in a nursery. A blind boy doing a science lesson, so the teacher says, "Tell me when you can feel the vibrations," teaching about electromagnetism. So he's brought to the centre of the lesson. I don't think any teacher in here couldn't do any of those things. Okay. This is something I filmed for the South African government.
Led to the development of a strong inclusive ethos were strong leadership from principals and school-based support team coordinators, a whole staff commitment to inclusion, flexible management, and a systematic approach to removing attitudinal, learning, and physical barriers within schools.
It is a good thing that they've taken the children who are disabled, because in the previous years, these children were kept at home, neglected. Now that the children are being brought into the school, they can be able to play with other children, they can be able to communicate with the teacher, they learn English, they learn all the languages which are being spoken at school, and they really feel part of the community. So it is a good thing. I think we're happy about that. We only wish it could be introduced in all the schools, not just particular schools, because these children who are disabled are all over.
Bukosi Bedford School in Mpumalanga is a full-service school. It was one of the first 10 schools in the province to be chosen to pilot inclusive education. Children aged 5 to 13 years attend. There are high levels of unemployment in the area, and the school runs a nutrition program to ensure that children receive food each day. The school welcomes disabled learners with a wide range of learning difficulties and physical impairments. Bukosi Bedford staff and governing body members believe that all pupils have a right to an education and the right to learn skills that will support them after school. At Bukosi Bedford, staff encourage all students to treat their disabled peers with equality and respect.
We used the white paper number 6 because it emphasized the fact that all learners can learn and all need support. So we wanted to change.
Okay. So we've run out of time, so I won't show you more on that. It's on my website, World of Inclusion, so you can see it. I just wanted to go on. Similarly, I've seen many adjustments, as we saw there, all over the middle and low income countries. So it's not about money, It's about attitude, it's about being prepared to make the change, to be different. Whether it be in Tanzania, Sri Lanka, Jamaica, the same things are happening. This is part of a worldwide movement, and I think we need to learn from each other around the world and share experience. If anyone's got a film of good practice in an inclusive setting, I've got a portal now on the world of inclusion. There's over 100 films up there already, free to share. Please send them to me, put them onto YouTube and send me the reference and a little sentence about it, and we'll put them up. Because it's sharing information which will make the difference. Learning from each other. I'm going to go through some of these next ones, much as interesting as they are, to the last couple of slides, because they want me to finish. Cost, of course, is a big thing. Right. So, in order to go forward, all governments must, in my view, adopt a 10-year plan to develop a fully inclusive education system. That will bring us in, if we start next year, just before 2030. Which is the deadline that the governments of the world have set themselves for the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to ring-fence funding for access programs, reasonable accommodation and support immediately, involve all children, students, disabled and non, to receive disability, equality and anti-bullying training, challenge complacency, reaction and corruption, particularly when it comes to loss of money that is funneling out of the system when it should be getting to our children. And I think the more money can be put down to the local people to administer, the less corruption that there will be. Every local area needs an inclusion resource centre. Funding must be locally controlled and globally provided. Bottom-up movement, an alliance for inclusive education. Special needs and medical model paradigms to be challenged at all levels and replaced by inclusive pedagogy, a twin-track approach, as I've outlined, high-tech and low-tech solutions. All teachers must receive disability, equality and inclusion training in service and pre-service, and develop inclusion. We need a democratic inclusion movement. We will benefit, all of us, from this change for the rest of this century and the rest of the world. However, on the horizon, there are problems. Which way for the world? Are we going to carry on putting people or profits first? Competition or collaboration? Inclusion can only occur with collaboration. High-stakes testing shows very little and is a waste of time and money and distorts the curriculum beyond any measure. Interesting, isn't it, that the highest stake exam results have consistently come in Finland, where there is no testing until the end of education. Teachers are high qualified, master level, and allowed to get on with it. We do know our job, we know what pedagogy is, we know how to do it. You wouldn't test doctors all the time, although some people are trying to. Respect our professionalism as teachers, but teachers in turn have to respect the knowledge and understanding of disabled children and their parents. So we have two ways to go. We can either go for an inclusive world, or we can go down the road, which is happening in some places, neoliberalism. Academies, for instance, in the UK came out only 2 days ago, taking less and less disabled children. So where are they to go? Well, there's been a growth in special schools. So that is not where we want to go. As Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. We must build a powerful grassroots global campaign for inclusive education of parents, young people, young disabled people who are those children grown up, teachers and governments, disabled adults, non-NGOs, UNICEF, UNESCO, World Bank, UNDESA, all means all, and we can get there. But we have to start doing it now. We've got 13 years. That isn't very long. We have to do it. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you agree with me if I say that we have just heard a very informative and